Hi, this is Louise Manning here from the Royal Agricultural University, and this is the next webinar in our series where we have been considering supply chain resilience and the factors that affect it. This webinar is going to look at bad behaviour and how we identify bad behaviour in food supply chains, and also how we seek to reduce our vulnerability as a business to such incidents. This video, along with many of the others in the series, are summaries of elements of the research work that I've done with many colleagues across the world over the last 4 years. If you would like to know more about the individual research papers and conference papers that we have produced as a group, then please do get in touch and I'll be very happy to tell you more. Whilst supply chain relationships at both global and local levels have added tremendous value to our food businesses across the last 30 years, there have also been incidents of bad behaviour. How do we identify those signals of bad behaviour, both as regulators, as food businesses, and as consumers, so that we can reduce our vulnerability to a food safety incident or food crime? In this webinar, we're going to consider 3 key questions. What is the emergent vocabulary in food supply chains around bad behaviour? What are the signals of bad behaviour we need to look out for? And what does this research imply for my business? One of the words I'd like to start with is compliance. And over the last 25 years, it's been a key word in the vocabulary of food supply chains. To comply, you either are undertaking an action or it can be a status for an individual business. What do I mean by that? We have, as an industry and as government bodies, will set up a series of standards or requirements that food businesses need to comply with in order to operate or to produce safe food of a consistent quality. Those standards are then demanded within the supply chain, and demonstration that you comply with those standards is demanded in food supply chains. Now, those standards can be first party, so an organisation developing its own requirements and then checking itself through a series of internal audits against that standard. It can be second party, so your customer may develop a series of standards and will audit you against those standards to make sure that you comply. Or they can be third party, so independent standards that are owned by an individual organisation, where your customer requires that you have a certified status of compliance, that you have met those standards. It's important to recognise that compliance is only one element of demonstrating that you as a business can produce safe food of a consistent quality. You're only demonstrating you meet the standards in the checklist and that you have done it on a given day in your operating cycle. So whilst we rely on businesses demonstrating they are compliant, there are still vulnerabilities that sit within that system. An emerging term is signal, and I just want to spend a little bit of time exploring what researchers and regulators mean when they talk about signals. So a signal is a piece of information that can arise from a single source or multiple sources that, when combined and analysed in a specific way, can give an indication of potential vulnerability or potential risk associated with a given food, drink, or feed material. And it's really important to think about feed materials here, because we have had several multi-billion-pound food safety incidents that, when it was tracked back, the contaminant arose at the feed stage. for example, dioxin and meat. And we've had several instances of that in Europe alone in the last 20 years. Signals can vary in intensity. So as an individual signal, it can be a strong signal to demonstrate there's a potential risk that you have highlighted actual food crime occurring, or it can be weak. Signals can relate to economic information, social and environmental factors. They can be internal to the business and relate to the products, processes, people, or business environment. Or they can be external to the organisation. And when we reflect on the horse meat incident, we can identify a number of signals, some strong, some weak, that were either social, economic, or about the food supply chain environment that could have, if we'd have picked them up, identified that we should have had much greater surveillance around beef supply chains. Signals are time-bound. They can give you historic information. They can tell you what happened in the past. They can be real-time. You have taken a test today, either at a border inspection post or within a supply chain at a quality control point that has identified to you that there is a potential risk associated with this product. Those kinds of signals, I would argue, are what we would call responsive. So you can have deductive signals, things that happened in the past, and you can have responsive signals where you have to take action. The third type of signal is predictive signal, something that could happen in the future. Now, some signals can have multiple time criteria. So they can be both responsive and predictive, for example. But you, as the person analysing those signals, have to be very clear how you are going to take that information and what you are going to do with it. Another term that is emerging in the literature is signal surveillance. Having identified that there are potential signals that could arise, which could identify to me that there is a problem in the supply chain with a particular ingredient, how do I then build a surveillance system around those signals where I'm either doing routine monitoring or less frequent verification and building that up into my risk management system? So it's important that everyone in the food supply chain is very aware of the term signal. How might we identify the signals of bad behaviour? Well, many academics have tried to categorise these potential signals of bad behaviour, whether we're thinking of food crime, food fraud, but I would argue that we can also extrapolate this to thinking about potential food safety incidents as well. Is the signal of bad behaviour associated with the product? So if we analyse the product, we are going to identify that somebody potentially has substituted a minor ingredient, has diluted the product. How is it connected to the process? So the signal of bad behaviour is about the fact that someone in the supply chain before us has substituted cage-reared eggs for free range. Is it about the people? So we are actually looking at social signals, how people behave. If I'm going to work with a factory, have I looked at the staff turnover in that business? Have I looked at absenteeism rates? Have I looked at the number of times that the supply chain is down and what the downtime is and what the causes were, and whether any of them were related to people rather than a breakdown with equipment? And what are the signals of bad behaviour associated with data? Is there evidence that quality control records have been tampered with? Is there evidence that the certificate of conformity is not correct? And so we can start to think of all those different signals of bad behaviour, which when we bring them all together, can then start to identify increased risk with a given material, product, or indeed business within the supply chain. With existing standards that have been developed, such as PAS 96, or other research that has sought to characterise the people that are involved with bad behaviour, what we have done is characterise them as being cybercriminals, hacktivists, disgruntled employees, extremists, terrorists, professional criminals, recreational criminals. But the question is, how do we identify the signals associated with bad behaviour? Are they derived from who people are, or are they derived from what they do? So when we think of signals of bad behaviour, are we characterising individuals or instead focusing on signs of poor action or consequence of bad behaviour? And that is really important when we think about how we develop our threat analysis, critical control point systems, when we think of our HACCP systems as well. And it's really important that we focus on behaviour. And when I talk about behaviour, I am not talking about the emerging literature on food safety culture and the culture of food businesses. I am focusing very much on the day-to-day practice of a business and whether people are complying or demonstrating deviance from given standards. And in some ways, that is just a subset of overall culture within a business. So how do we identify bad behaviour in food supply chains? Well, historically, we've had a whole range of vocabulary that sits around activities that we undertake in supply chains. We undertake inspections, audits, very often to verify that businesses and individuals are complying with given standards. We develop checklists to use in that process. We develop monitoring and surveillance systems to check products, to identify whether documentation has met given standards. But what I want to think about is how we develop signal detection systems and also how we develop amplification of those signals. Now, this is emerging in practice on the ground in food supply chains. For many businesses, they have not done a signal analysis. And one of the areas we're looking at is how we can provide training and support for businesses that are seeking to go in this direction. Because this lies at the heart of how you develop a holistic, integrated business risk management plan, of which audits and third-party certification form a part. What do I mean by a signal surveillance system? Well, first of all, a business has to identify those signals. And as we said, they could be economic, social, environmental. They could be internal to the business or external. So what are the signals that may identify bad behaviour in your supply chains? How are you going to monitor those signals? Are they real time? And so you can be reactive. Are you developing a predictive model, or are you doing deductive analysis of signals, for example, customer complaints? How are you going to both monitor the signals and also analyse them? And having analysed those signals, how are you going to turn that analysis data into information that will not only identify the level of risk threat and the degree of risk, but will also identify appropriate corrective action. And when you've taken action and addressed that risk, how do you then feed that back into your signal identification, detection, and analysis process? And this is a key element of how businesses reduce their vulnerability to food crime and risk, and also how they continually ensure they are delivering safe product that is of a consistent quality. So in this video, we've covered 3 questions. What is the emergent vocabulary in food supply chains? I've spoken about signals and how we can start to define signals in more detail. I've also tried to think about how we could break those signals down in particular groups, those associated with the product, those associated with the process in how the ingredients or the product has been produced, and also the claims we make about that product. Signals that are associated with people, and also signals that we derive from data. As a result, we can start to consider how we draw those signals together into a monitoring plan so that we can undertake surveillance, and how we analyse both the weak and the strong signals that may arise, and how we can build an effective food safety and food crime risk management plan for the business. So now we're going to open up to the question and answer session of the webinar. Please do ask lots of questions, because it'd be really great to have a discussion around these emerging areas of research. Thank you.